just another story of the same, you know, having a good time. But just be respectful, dudes, and never learn until it's too late. Have a good time, What's up, y'all? Welcome back to another episode of the Baltimore Bureau Podcast here on the Real News Network. I'm Easy Jackson. Thundercats.
All right.
We were talking about Thundercats coming in here. Shout out to all the 80s babies out there.
Yep.
We need a Thundercats movie, apparently.
Bro.
I think so. Khalilah doesn't agree.
No. That's why I'm Dr. Khalilah Harris.
Dr. Khalilah M. Harris, Esquire.
If it ain't broke,
does not
don't fix it.
Agree, but I think a Thundercats movie would be amazing.
All right, let's get into Baltimore.
Let's get into Baltimore. This week we have some dope stories. Last weekend was the Baltimore Ceasefire. So shout out to everybody that was involved in the Baltimore Ceasefire. There was one fatal shooting, but it was the 1 year anniversary of the ceasefire. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. But shout out to everybody pushing for peace and trying to help make change in the city. Really, really proud of that movement and happy to know that it's happening in Baltimore. This first interview is with Marc Steiner and our friend Sean Yoes, who just recently dropped a book on Baltimore since Freddie Gray. And they discuss other victims of police violence, other violence, specifically lifting up Lil Scooter, who is a well-known rapper from here who was murdered, and Corinne Gaines, who was murdered by Baltimore County police officers. They also talk about ceasefire. So let's check this out. Let's start off with this.
No matter where you live in this country, you've heard of Freddie Gray. You've heard of the death of Freddie Gray at the hands of police officers in Baltimore City, and the trials that took place of the officers accused of his death, who then won their cases in those courts. So it gripped the country, it gripped the city, obviously. Rebellion took place after Freddie Gray was killed and continued, and the city has really never been the same since, and it's emblematic of the situation in this country, no matter where you live in America. And our guest today is Sean Yoes, who wrote the book Baltimore After Freddie Gray. Now, Sean is also the editor of the Baltimore Afro-American newspapers and is the co-host of Truth and Reconciliation with Taya Graham and Stephen Janis, who are reporters here at the Real News Network, and joins us here in our studios for the Marc Steiner Show. And Sean, welcome. Good to have you with us.
Good to see you, Mark, as always.
So this is always great to see you. So this book, I mean, I know you followed this trial. You followed what happened intensely when he was killed and when the rebellion took place, and they locked the kids up from being able to get to their transportation around Mondawmin Mall on the west side of Baltimore. But something drove you to write this book that came out of the columns that you wrote for the Afro-American.
Yeah, I think I thought then, and I obviously think now, that it's really important to tell our stories from a perspective of Baltimore, as opposed to, I think one of the things that really sparked me to write this book was after the officers were charged. And remember how all the different news organizations, CNN, MSNBC, all kind of converged on the city, and there was that big rally at City Hall. And I just remember looking at those people who were covering us and reporting back about the city, and I just kept thinking, they don't know anything about us. They don't know anything about this city. And I just think that it's super important for people like you and people like me who are born and raised here. That doesn't mean people who aren't born and raised here can't tell the Baltimore story. But I think it is very important for people like you and I to tell our story. And so that's really at the foundation of why I wanted to put these columns together and the other work as far as the forwards are concerned, in order for us to have the most authentic voice possible to speak to these really critical years in our city post the death of Freddie Gray and the subsequent uprising.
Now, you mentioned before, but the introduction to the book is written by Larry Gibson, one of our noted attorneys in this country, who's run campaigns across the globe, and gave a great history of Black Baltimore in the 19th and early 20th century, which I thought was really good. Really set the tone for all of it.
Him and Frances Murphy Draper, the publisher of the Afro, the granddaughter of Carl Murphy, the man who led the Afro through the golden age. So they're like two living portals of history to our city, and I was really fortunate, very blessed to have them both be able to help set the context, the historical context of what transpired in those days and those years, the 3 years after Freddie Gray.
Let's get to the heart of this. Well, there are a number of things here that I think are really important, because you divided the book up into a series of chapters based on the columns that you wrote.
Right.
That cover a lot of Baltimore. They all tie into this issue of Freddie Gray and his death. But let's talk about some names here,
Sure.
right?
Sure.
So in the book, we talk about Lawrence Scooter, Corin Gaines, Charmaine Wilson, and Cody Young, Tyrone West, and of course Freddie Gray.
Yeah.
All people who were murdered and killed in the city.
Yeah.
Some of these people were murdered in interchanges with the police. Some people were murdered on the street by men and women in the street.
Yeah.
So, but in some senses, you, in a spiritual and political sense, put them together, right? So, so talk a bit about why you did that and what that means.
Yeah, I mean, so to go back even further, if you go to the dedication of my book, I dedicated to my mother,
right,
who was murdered in 2004. She's a part of it too, and I think the point is that there are so many victims of violence in our city. You know, I was having a conversation with a young woman on the way over here, and I had said to her, you know, we were talking about the fact that my mother had been killed in the city, and the whole point of making her a part of the book was not just to pay my respect and my honor, pay homage and give my love to my mother. It was to show that there are thousands of people like me in this city who have lost loved ones to violence, and their killers are still walking among the people.
Your mother's killer's never been found.
Right. But there's so many people like me in this city. Since the book has been published, there have been a lot of people who have said to me, you know what, my sister got killed, was murdered. My mother was murdered. I mean, think about that. I mean, there are literally thousands of people walking the streets of Baltimore whose loved ones were taken because of violence, and that's part of the conversation of the book, I believe.
Literally, I mean, when you have murders happening 300 a year for years and years and years, as I told you before we went on the air, that when I first started my radio show in 1993, for the first 10 years of the show, I was covering what was going on in our city, was also covering many other things, including what was going on in Belfast, Northern Ireland.
Right.
More people were killed in that period of those 10 years in Baltimore than were killed in Belfast in the middle of a war.
Sure.
So we're talking about a war zone that
absolutely
erupts in a place like our city.
And we were talking offline, I mean, before we started. In '93, when you started, we were 10 years into the crack epidemic in Baltimore City, really. And so in some ways, we've never recovered from that. And then when you talk about mass incarceration with the zero tolerance policing policy, we still haven't recovered from that policing strategy, that failed policing strategy.
Let me slowly kind of try to connect the dots, and some of the ones you just connect in your book through your columns.
Sure.
So when we take the tragic murder of your mother, let's say, and other people in the city, and you're the son of a postman.
Yeah.
Right?
That's right.
A working class kid who grew up in Baltimore.
I am the embodiment of that kid, yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So we're not talking about a kid who had to live with his family inside the projects in the heart of an inner city neighborhood.
But still the heart of West Baltimore. But
not the heart of West Baltimore.
Yeah.
Right. So but that says a lot when we think about the people whose lives are sacrificed in a city like this. And people think, okay, well, poor kid comes from the black streets, he's on the corner, of course, he's got to confront this stuff, blah, 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 every day of his life. But it's so much deeper than that.
Absolutely.
And I think what you're describing in the book is the depth of it, in many ways, and not our common perception of what it really is.
Oh, yeah, I think that's absolutely true. I think that, I mean, you know as well as I do, maybe even better than I do, the perception of Baltimore, from the outside in particular, people, they really believe. I had friends from Chicago, talk to me about Baltimore. Like, oh my God, from Chicago. Oh, is it that? Is it really that bad? I'm like, you're from Chicago. And they're like, but we saw The Wire. And that, And it's a weird thing, though. I mean, I don't disparage David for making The Wire. I was in The Wire. I had a part in Rolling The Wire. We both had parts.
In The Wire.
Right, we both were in The Wire. So I would never disparage David for telling his story. But the point is that the outside world gravitates to those images and those stories. And as you just said so smartly, it's much deeper than that, I think. You know?
So what's the connection for you between the death of Lawrence Scooter, who was a rapper who was in the gang life himself a little bit, trying to get out of it, but went to an anti-violence rally himself and was murdered, to the death of Freddie Gray, who died at the hands of police. So for you, what is that connection? Because you put them together in many ways in the list at the beginning of the book, and you tell their stories throughout the book. So I mean, so what's the connection?
Well, I think that you speak to, wow, that's a great question. You speak to it a little bit, or you kind of alluding to it as you gave me the question. Lil Scooter is on his way back from a Stop the Violence rally, and he is at a traffic light, and some cat runs up and kills him. Allegedly, there was some beef that had been going back and forth. Freddie Gray, he had scrapes with the law. He had been in and out of jail a little bit. He had had some issues, obviously, with drug addiction. But on that day, he was just thinking about when we're going to eat for breakfast.
Right.
And he winds up getting, locked up and eventually losing his life. Two young black men who were not immersed in the element that usually takes young men's lives at that moment in time, but because of circumstances or because of their past or because of what they may have gone through in the past, it's almost as if the streets pull you back in and you become a victim of what may have happened in the past or what might. It's always in Baltimore, not always, but oftentimes it's about perception. Like, I had a cat once say to me once, he had just gotten back home from jail, and he said the reason why most guys get into conflicts and die in Baltimore is because they hear that somebody is looking for them. And the attitude is, I'm not gonna let him come get me, I'm gonna go get him.
Right.
And that happens, that narrative plays itself out over and over and over again in our city. And there's something about that has to be broken and has to be cured, but that's a whole, I think.
And it's not just the cities, it's beyond the city. I mean, it affects women as it does men. You write about Corinne Gaines, who was a young woman who was killed by Baltimore County policemen. Yeah. In a situation that many people think she could have been talked out of where she was rather than shot, right? And had she been probably white in a different situation, she may not have been shot.
You remember Joe Palczynski.
Right.
You know?
Exactly. We can tell that story in a minute, and how that fits. And then you talk about Charmaine Wilson, who reported, as you wrote about, to the police that her son was beaten up and his bicycle seat taken, and then she was murdered.
Right. His siblings had been bullied. She had been bullied. I mean, she had attempted to call police on drug dealers on numerous occasions.
So there's an arc here to me. I mean, and I'm curious about how you think about it in terms of all the columns you wrote and the chapters you wrote here, just about that arc between, I think it was Ivan Potts you wrote about, a young man who came out of prison, who said that the police were a gang, that they run up on you just like any other gang.
I'll never forget what he said specifically.
Say it, go ahead.
He said the cops looked at him like, we're just like you. That his perception of what the police were trying to convey to him, because two of the cops who arrested him were members of the Gun Trace Task Force. Their energy was like, we're just like you. We just have badges. We just have guns that have been issued by the state. But there was no real line in between Ivan Potts and the police that arrested him, and ultimately that's what freed him.
So if you take the other part, you spend a lot of time in the book also writing about men and women who are trying to do something to change the situation we're in.
Right.
And you write about people like Erica Bridgeford, who started Ceasefire, which has done amazing work, and David Miller, another son of the West Side who went to your high school, Walbrook High School, right? Yeah. Who that you write about as Walbrook Warriors.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Get it correct.
For those of you around the country who don't understand, in Baltimore, when we talk about stuff, when they say, what school did you go to? They talk about high school.
It's never college. It's always high school. Forest Park. No, city.
City, man.
City.
I was expelled.
Well, you went to... sometimes I don't doubt that. I don't doubt that.
But so what I want to raise here is you're also talking about men and women who are trying to make a difference in kind of actually doing things to ameliorate the violence and change the nature of people's lives in the city. So what do you learn from that? What do we learn from that? What does the city learn from David Miller and Erica Bridgeford?
When you think, and those two are the...
And this city could be any city in America right now, by the way. Right?
Truth. When you think about specifically David and Erica, and you think about how hard they grind every single day, it's love. And that's the unifying thread that runs through all of those stories of the people that I write about who are doing this incredible work, whether it's Erica Bridgeford or Latrice Gant or Ogun Gordy or David Miller or Cameron Miles or Ray Kelly or Nicole Mundell. It's the love for the city and for the people of the city. That's what it's all about.
Yeah, I'm glad Sean Yoes wrote the book. I want to check it out because Baltimore has really changed since Freddie Gray a lot. I've seen it. I've talked about this before, but right around that time, I was just coming off of my first U.S. tour, and I've been all around the country, and to see this happening when I came home. I remember when I first found out that Freddie Gray was in the hospital, and I remember saying specifically to somebody, to several people, I was like, I hope that he doesn't die because Baltimore is not Ferguson.
Yeah. So many of us thought that, right? Like, this is not Ferguson.
Yeah.
Despite the similarities in socioeconomic factors, different place.
Yeah, and no disrespect to Ferguson at all. It was it's just having grown up here and knowing about I've known about Rough Rides since I was like 14, 15 years old. You know what I mean?
Students would talk about it like, yeah, they picked us up this weekend.
Yeah, beat me up, and it was like, it was a story that was typical of what happens when you get picked up by the police. But I feel like social media has helped like shed a light on it happening. You know what I mean? Because before we had like Instagram and Facebook and all that stuff, you just had the media and hearsay. And the last thing we really had heard about was Rodney King. You know what I mean? In the 90s.
That scale.
You know what I'm saying? At that scale like that. You know, and then once it started happening like regularly, and it was like Baltimore, we like, yo, this happens all the time. You know what I mean? Like, and
even the concept of how policing occurs that people think is, you know.
Yeah,
it keeps us safe. You know, it's cool, but the idea, and I actually, I've seen it before on a police ride along. You know, police ride along, you ride the whole shift with them. I've seen it just going into the kids' neighborhoods when I'm going to hem them up or I'm going to give them some love because their mother promised me a plate of food, where the police roll up and they just look to see who looks like they're about to run. They jump out on them and, you know, just start jacking them up. Like, what did they do? What did the kids do? And inevitably it's like, don't worry about that, Mahars. That happened every weekend. You know, and just what we think about what policing means and what strategies are acceptable for our community. Yeah. And then you know, when they talk about spoke about Corinne Gaines, and you think about sovereignty, and people feeling like they are sovereign Americans as opposed to in a perpetual state of enslavement, and how dare she believe she had any autonomy to direct what was going to happen in her home. It's just, you know,
it's crazy, man. But yeah, shout out to Sean Yoes, shout out to Marc Steiner, great interview. This next piece, we talked about the Baltimore Ceasefire happening this past weekend and 1 year anniversary. I did a story on that. the ceasefire I've been covering since the beginning, and it was really I felt like it was a good day. You know, I mean, a good weekend in terms of like the events and the celebrations. So check this out. The first weekend in August marked the 1-year anniversary of Baltimore's ceasefire, when ordinary citizens grappling with the deadliest year in the city's history demanded the violence must end.
It became very clear pretty quickly that I've been hearing this my entire life. People talking about somebody should call a ceasefire. People have called ceasefires. I had never seen it done in a way where the entire city was involved in calling the ceasefire, though.
This weekend was a celebration of sorts. A parade that went through the city with over 500 people was held early on Saturday, August 4th. That evening, members of Baltimore's music community performed for over 150 attendees. Baltimore Ceasefire 365 has held quarterly ceasefire weekends to ask that nobody kill anybody for 72 hours. Their fifth was held the first weekend of August, but by Sunday, August 5th, 5 people were shot, and one of those shootings was fatal. According to the Baltimore Sun, this was the first fatal shooting during a ceasefire weekend this year. With over 170 murders this year so far, homicides are down, but still very high. During ceasefire weekends, communities throughout the city hold events from block parties and prayer circles to pop-up criminal record expungement clinics and job fairs. 2017 ended with 343 murders, a new per capita record, but each ceasefire weekend has seen a decline in murder. The first weekend in August of 2017 saw only 2 compared to 6 the weekend before. In February of this year, the ceasefire weekend was followed with a downturn in gun violence, including a total of 12 days without murder. To mark the 1-year anniversary and honor lives lost to murder in Baltimore, Shamika Dream held a sage smudging on Charles Street, which runs through the city separating east from west.
African people have burned and smudged with anything that we have, using sage as well as Palo Santo and sweetgrass. It was about just needing to do something more to clear the air in Baltimore and to create space so that healing can happen and peace can happen.
The Ceasefire 365 movement was co-founded by Erica Bridgeford after learning from her son that Baltimore's murder rate was the highest it had ever been. Some call Bridgeford the mother of the ceasefire movement.
My son, Paul, said, "Mom, do you know that the murder rate is higher than it's ever been in Baltimore?" And I said, "No, I did not know that."
Bridgeford's family has been personally impacted. We spoke with her mother, Jerry, who lost her son, David, to gun violence in 2007.
Erica was his big sister. I think about how proud he would be of her. Actually, that's the part that I think about. The grief and the missing is endless. That's an endless black hole that just never stops on a daily basis.
Ceasefire's inclusive approach has inspired many people to get involved since last year.
Finally, I felt affirmed that the respect for black African life here in Baltimore, but period, in this toxic period where you see law enforcement, where you see other black African people murdering and killing one another, that someone else believes that African black life, all life has an intrinsic decency and value, and regardless of your economic status, your racial classification, that your life, if you're poor, a person of color, particularly if you're African black, that your life is worth something.
Organizers of Ceasefire aim to encourage empathy and concern for the lives lost to violence in the city, embodied in their slogans, "Don't be numb" and "Vibrate higher." They began a ritual they call Sacred 7, where they show up to the location where a murder occurred to declare it a sacred space.
This is going to grow into something amazing and beautiful, and I don't want nobody to sleep on it.
But ceasefire organizers believe the violence won't come to an end until its root causes are addressed, providing services and events that aim to change conditions for many of the city's residents.
People are violent because they're stressed out. People are violent because they can't pay their rent. They're not getting adequate health care. They don't have the right information around housing. They feel that they can't talk up for themselves as a tenant because they don't have good credit. So the landlord's getting over on them. Why? People have criminal cases, petty criminal cases that they just don't have enough information about.
The ceasefire anniversary weekend saw over 20 events throughout the city. Organizers say thousands of people came to meetings, planned events, and attended Sacred Sevens. Students have done projects and written papers on the movement as well.
4 songs got made about the Baltimore ceasefire, and the one that most exemplifies it, where a bunch of artists came together and made a song, that one is currently nominated for a Grammy out here.
And Baltimore Ceasefire 365 says their first year was just the beginning. Self-destruction, raise the city murder rate. Shout out to Von Vargas. I love the Ceasefire song, the collaboration. It's dope. And it's such a good, I think, mix of artists. I was supposed to be on that song. And I didn't.
You were there in spirit.
I didn't get my verse in time enough. But shout out to Von. Von is now the president of our local chapter of the Grammys.
Oh, nice.
And doing a lot of work in terms of getting artists, you know what I mean? Just getting more exposure for Baltimore, building relationships for Baltimore, educating Baltimore artists on what they need to do. But the ceasefire, man, I cannot say enough about this work. It really amazes me that they're able to do what they do. But we talked earlier about the police, and I think this is a strong example of, you know, it taking a village. You know what I mean? Like, we can't just sit back and wait for the police to do everything. I found out while I was doing the story that barely 1 in 3 homicides end up in arrests.
That sounds right. And that's a part of why people don't get involved with reporting. I mean, we saw that out of Chicago, right? This past week, where they had like 72 people shot over the weekend, and then you have the mayor come out and say, well, we need community to step up and partner with us. And then you have community advocates like, sir, your policies help to perpetuate this whole situation.
And you're not funding the community that you're asking to step up.
This is what a pastor said. I was listening to NPR. This is what the pastor said. The pastor's like, where is the HUD money that can go into and other federal grants that could go into supporting these communities to being able to recognize economic mobility? And I used to think it was flim-flam, but then I realized citizens know you're not solving cases. So you want them to put their neck on the line, right? Like the pastor was like, I used to say to people, come on, you don't know that. And then I realized over time, like, no, they are right. The cases are not being solved. So now they're going to step up and say, I saw such and such. You know, I know such and such does. And there's no witness protection program there. I don't know that there's one here. I'm pretty sure there's not one here. And you want people to put their neck on the line, and you're not going to solve the case?
It's a crazy thing to ask a mother who lost their child a year, 2 years after, if they ever found out who did it. And to hear them go, no. Like that, those are the kind of things that I just feel like it should not happen. You know what I mean?
To hear them go no and get a whiff of knowledge that she knows who did it. But
that's even worse.
Right, because I've seen that.
That's even worse.
I've seen that.
Yeah, me too.
Where the hood knows who did it.
Yeah.
But
ain't nobody saying nothing.
Nobody is going to even whisper in the wrong space that they know, for fear that somebody's going to try to come knock on their door when other people are looking, you know? So that burns, I would say, even deeper, where there is no justice in the injustice in so many levels. And you have this great loss, right?
Yeah, man. So I really, my hat's off to Erica Bridgeford and Okun and Shells, Latrice, and everybody, Darnell, everybody involved in the ceasefire, man. Like, y'all are true heroes. Keep it up. You inspire me, and we'll continue to follow y'all. Let's move into, we're talking about the police. I want to jump into this story that Taya and Steven did. Even under federal monitoring, American police ignore the law. So we got no, you don't say.
No, I can't even imagine that in the United States. The police aren't following the law. Well, you're acting as if they're above the law.
Right. That can't be possible.
Can't be possible.
So let's check this out. Taya Graham and Stephen Janis.
There was hope that with federal oversight, the Baltimore City Police Department could be reformed, but a new report raises doubts.
When this was locked down, this board should have went to the media and said, you're in violation.
It was a scene of tension and anger with Baltimore police.
Everything in the city is related to race and the disparities that exist, not just with the police department.
Residents of the West Baltimore community, Harlem Park, voicing their outrage last year about an extended lockdown of their neighborhood.
The police cannot police the police. What we're dealing with in Baltimore City is a criminal organization.
For roughly a week after Detective Sean Suter was found shot in a nearby alley, police cordoned off 6 blocks, forcing residents to carry papers, subjecting them to pat-downs and searches. And now a report from the Federal Monitor tasked with overseeing the consent decree between the Justice Department and Baltimore City has determined that these tactics were illegal.
The perimeter was held for an extra 3 days. And during those 3 days, people's freedom to travel was restricted.
A profound finding for a department that was already under the decree at the time of their lockdown. And a revelation that did not surprise State Senator Jill Carter, who called the Harlem Park meeting.
The report said that the police implemented unconstitutional practices in Harlem Park. Does that surprise you?
Of course not. It was a no-brainer that cordoning off that community, especially when we were already under a consent decree, was really, it was astounding that they even did it. But I think that what is a little troubling, more than a little troubling, is the focus seems to be on length of time of detentions, as opposed to the idea that the entire community should not have been locked down. And especially in a city where we have about, I believe the number is around 170 homicides this year alone. And those extraordinary measures are never used for the non-officer, the non-law enforcement officer. And so you're sending a strong message to the community that officers' lives are far more valuable than the average citizen.
The report says police searched residents without probable cause, ran warrant checks without reasonable suspicion, and even turned off body-worn cameras during the lockdown. But this was not all the report revealed, because buried in the details of the document were stunning revelations about the state of the police department and the limits of the monitor to hold it accountable. Among those revelations, this is a standout. The monitor stating that they could not assess stops, searches, and arrests. But why? According to the report, thousands and thousands of poorly organized paper records which would be impractical to assess. The bottom line, the primary area where the Justice Department found the Baltimore City Police engaged in racial and unconstitutional tactics is beyond the purview of the monitor tasked with fixing it. It's another aspect of policing that David Roca of the ACLU says raises more questions than answers.
Look, any murder is an extraordinary event, but the Constitution doesn't evaporate when police are investigating a murder. And when they're investigating the murder of a police officer, perhaps that's the most important time when the constitutional limits ought to be adhered to, because that's when there's likely the greatest incentive on the part of the police to violate.
And is troubling for a department that, for now, remains seemingly inscrutable.
You know, people, it's funny, I joke about the Handmaid's Tale and how much of a split second we are away from
that reality. Yeah.
That reality of a small group of people making decisions for the rest of us and using the law.
Yeah.
You know, as a tool to remove all civil liberties, right?
I mean, you talk about like how they blocked off that neighborhood where Detective Sean Yoes was murdered, and that's one of my old neighborhoods I grew up in.
I lived in that neighborhood for 10 years.
Yeah?
Yep.
Oh, yeah, I was on the 800 block of Harlem Avenue.
I was on Myrtle Avenue.
Oh, right around the corner.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And it's such an interesting community. You know, I kind of talked about this with Boehner. He's a few weeks ago, but that community is very much together in terms of like the blocks and the neighborhoods. You know what I mean? Like
it's cohesive.
It's very cohesive. You know what I mean? So it's really I felt like it was such a sign of disrespect to that community to block them, to cut them off like that. People couldn't come in, go out. They made such a spectacle of it. And it's just like right in our faces. Like you were saying earlier, like people know, you know what I mean? Like, and the whole city was walking around. I'm sorry to laugh about it, but the whole city was walking around during that time going,
oh, okay.
Yeah, the police did it. Like, duh. Like,
right. So you're going to stop all of these people when there's a strong likelihood, like, I don't know, I wasn't there, no video, that you all killed this man. And so you're going to now use psychological warfare against our people to convince us that we did something that maybe you did. Right? And we don't know the answers to that. And you make no apologies about removing our civil liberties under the guise of doing this type of investigation when you don't do it for us. You don't lock down the community when my child is killed. But you're going to lock down the community for this officer. May he rest in peace. Under the guise of, you know, for some reason, this particular homicide requires a higher level. And, you know, I'd even say than other police officers. He's not the first police officer to get shot and killed in the hood.
And they didn't lock down
anybody
neighborhoods with those.
Right. So what is it about this one, other than the appearance of...
we didn't do it.
Right. Of clean hands, right? And so you use unclean hand strategies to police this community in a way that is signaling to them, don't step out of line. Right?
Yeah.
You know, you need to now coalesce with us telling a version of a story.
But here's the crazy thing is like, me knowing that community, knowing that neighborhood, and I would like talk to some people from around there after this or whatever, and we was just like, yo, first of all, ain't nobody from around here killing no police officer. There's too much drug money coming around here. Like, you're gonna make it hot. You know what I'm saying? Like nobody in that neighborhood is going to kill a police officer.
Listen, before I had details on how he was connected to the gun trace task force, Detective Souter. Before I heard any of those details, and before I heard that, you know, he was supposed to testify the next day, right? What I said to myself is, I'm like, yo, whoever the clown is that killed this officer, they in trouble because they gonna make the block hot. And then as the details start coming out, I'm like, ain't nobody over there killed that police officer.
Ain't nobody that dumb.
Come on.
Ain't nobody that dumb. Like, and it's just, it's amazing that how much above the law they are and how much power they have. We talked earlier about, you know, Sean Yoes' book and the Freddie Gray incident and what happened then. Not far from the same area where Detective Sean Yoes was killed.
Down the block.
West Baltimore. That's West Baltimore. I was teaching hip-hop classes over at Yo Baltimore. And I remember going around there and walking through some of those blocks where it's like open drug market normally. And I noticed no police.
None.
Every other time I come through there, you see the police, like, they patrol, you know what I mean? Because there's so much around there, you know? And of course, we all know that in areas of poverty, police patrol more. 21215 was one of the areas with the highest number of marijuana arrests and the lowest median income. So you're used to seeing police, you know what I mean? And it was like, after Freddie Gray, they was just like, I'm good.
Yeah, because we got y'all drugs and we selling it over
Yep.
here.
Right, right.
I mean, so another connection in this for me, you know, my passion and my heart is in education, and I started my education career teaching and coordinating programming for students to learn more about the law using a strategy called street law. A model that came out of Georgetown Law Center, where you have lawyers, law students, teaching young people in high schools and in schools about the rule of law, and that you are not outside of the law. This law is supposed to work for you. And so when you hear Taya say people are being searched without probable cause, you think about how education needs to play a role in making sure people are empowered to maintain their sovereignty in the way that Corinne Gaines. I mean, Corinne Gaines, a part of what the problem is with her was she's a smart black woman.
Yeah.
She's a smart black woman. Like nothing, I know exactly what the law is, and I'm going to keep reciting it back to you, and I know what my rights are. And I just think about how our schools, and also education more broadly, right? I think we also need to embrace a philosophy where not only is it not up to, just like with ceasefire, it's not just up to police to make safer communities. Right. It is also not up to just the school system and the government to educate our children.
Right.
I think we need to branch back out to that and make sure our young people are clear. The law is theirs also.
Yeah.
You know? So.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, well, let's talk about something we've been beating up on. We've been beating up on Baltimore City, the officers.
Now let's talk about how they poison us.
Yeah.
JK.
Well, this one is actually a good thing. Donna Noor did. She covered a press conference. I think This past Monday, yeah. Baltimore set to be first major U.S. city to ban water privatization. Shout out to the Baltimore City Council, who I personally don't feel like have been doing a terrible job.
Lately, right?
Lately
like
they've been doing.
Like, y'all are whack.
Yeah,
and now
yeah.
It's like, y'all got a little something about you. Come on now. We might reelect some of you.
Right. We might keep some of y'all around for a few years.
Yeah. I
so
agree.
let's check this story out.
God created heavens. He first created the water. And so we want to make certain that water remains in the hands of the people of Baltimore City now and forever.
Baltimore is on track to become the first major U.S. city to ban water privatization.
This bill is approved.
At a hearing on Monday, City Council voted unanimously to pass a resolution proposed by Council President Jack Young to ban the sale and lease of Baltimore's troubled water and sewage systems.
Well, today, this council stands here to say enough is enough. With the introduction of this charter amendment, we're closing the door on the possibility of privatizing Baltimore's water and sewer system.
Before the hearing, environmental advocates, council members, unions, and faith-based groups held a press conference in City Hall to drum up support.
Water privatization, simply put, is unethical, immoral, and dangerous. Communities that have privatized their water systems see skyrocketing rates, lost jobs, and declined quality of service, because when corporations come in to run water and sewer systems, they have one goal and one goal only, and that is profit, not the public good.
Among the attendees was Mayor Catherine Pugh, who originally proposed this charter amendment at the end of June.
I don't care how folks will double down when trying to buy our water system. It is not an option. It has never been an option under this administration.
The mayor did, to her credit, had it in her package of charter amendments, but it was lumped up with a lot of other stuff that we didn't agree with, so we just picked out the stuff that we wanted and overlooked that piece.
If the mayor signs the amendment by August 13th, the proposal will go before voters on the November ballot. If it passes, the resolution will amend the city's charter to preserve public ownership and control over water and sewage systems.
I'm confident that voters in November will overwhelmingly approve this change to the city's charter that will prevent the destruction of Baltimore's water system.
This would be the first charter amendment of its kind in the country, and the first major citywide ban on water privatization.
The first city in the country to do this was the city of Northampton, Massachusetts, but Baltimore is, the first major city in the country to take this proactive measure.
This comes during a crisis of water affordability and accessibility in Baltimore. The city's sewage system is a century old and creates major challenges for residents. Under a federal consent decree, Baltimore must spend $1.6 billion to repair it. The city says this prompted them to raise water and sewage bills by 33% over the past 3 years. Eccles says that if the city's water were privatized, they'd go up even more.
Been an enormous amount. The rates have quadrupled in, I think, the past 16 years. We know that the rates are going up a lot, but they're not going up and adding inflation for corporate profits, inflation for CEOs, inflation for people who are running a corporation.
City officials have maintained that they're not trying to privatize the water delivery system.
There are absolutely no plans for privatization.
But this hasn't eased fear amongst anti-privatization advocates, especially because last year, lobbyists pitched handing over control of the water system to Suez Environment, a French utility company.
These companies coming in from Europe and other places trying to privatize our water, outsource our jobs, and take away our jobs from these hard-working public works employees.
Water privatization companies have been circling Baltimore since 1997. So we've seen them really push even harder in the last few years. Veolia was trying to come in 2014. Suez has been coming in and trying to pitch the city on a 50-year concession lease.
Advocates say that water privatization would mean a loss of jobs.
And nationally, they've said whenever you privatize a contract or outsource, we in the ASME know that we lose 30% to 40% of the workforce. These are workers that live, 95% of our workers of ASME Local 44 and Housing Authority live in the city of Baltimore.
And are concerned that it could exacerbate inequality.
What they will do is they tend to cut corners when it comes to materials. They will use cheaper pipes, or they will do less maintenance. They will cherry pick areas where they will prioritize maintenance, and that tends to be in predominantly white neighborhoods. So communities of color and low-income communities get left behind.
They say that the federal government's antagonism toward public utilities makes this proposal even more historic.
Trump's infrastructure plan has essentially incentivized cities to privatize their water system by increasing matching federal funds for cities that will. And so I think this really is a reboot to that, and to say that we are opposing any and all privatization is so powerful, especially in a climate that's handing out benefits to corporations left and right.
This bill right here is going to galvanize all of us to work together to make sure we can show them on this local level in Baltimore City that we can carry this throughout the state and throughout the country, so we can tell people like President Donald Trump to stop privatizing, outsourcing, and contracting out our jobs.
I always love when Baltimore is a first, or Maryland is a first.
Yeah. Set the stage.
Yeah.
Press forward. Don't wait on anybody else to make things happen. We don't like to do what outsiders do first.
Right. Yeah.
That's pure and true Baltimore and Maryland being a provincial colony.
Mm-hmm.
But no, we want ours.
We want to have
even if
our
what you
own.
have seems nice, we're gonna do it our way first.
Yeah.
So it's dope.
So shout out to the Baltimore City Council for stepping up and doing that. Let's stick. Darna is. Of course, y'all always know I give Darna her props on her coverage of climate change. This is Baltimore organizers say climate justice is also health, housing, and transit justice. Check it out.
The Baltimore People's Climate Movement, a coalition of environmental and community groups, held their first town hall at the Real News headquarters to explore the relationships between housing, transit, health, and climate justice.
When we think about climate change, I think that most people tend to keep the conversation centered around natural spaces, right? So the way it impacts our water quality, the way it impacts our air and, trees and things like that. But it's really important to think about the ways that climate change impacts our health as well, because it certainly does.
Moderated by the Real News Network's Khalilah Harris and Marc Steiner, the forum brought together advocates and experts in each of these fields.
The reason I'm here today is to talk about how climate change affects indoor air quality and public health issues as it relates to sewage backups in the city.
You want the neighborhood to have, to be safe. You want it to have green.
Panelists stressed that climate change puts strain not only on what's commonly thought of as our natural world, but also on our city's infrastructure.
Baltimore right now has an issue with its sewage infrastructure. Residents have been facing sewage backups into their basements, into their homes.
And the effects on our infrastructure can in turn affect public health.
direct contact with sewage is very dangerous. It can cause internal infections and also skin infections. If you touch, you're not supposed to touch sewage with your bare hands or your bare skin.
Baltimore is highest asthma in the state. When you have global warming, when the air warms, it actually holds more pollutants in suspension. And transit contribution to that amount actually can grow if we don't halt the spread of, for example, highways. Rather than investing in mass transit.
Though climate change is a global phenomenon, it hits some harder than others.
If you're living in housing that experiences a lot of challenges because the housing quality isn't the best, climate change is just going to make that worse. If you're already experiencing asthma because of the way your community is shaped, you know, the pollution that exists in your community, the pests, the mold in your community, climate change is going to make that worse.
The advocates know that they're facing an uphill battle, especially since the federal government is rolling back environmental protections.
Well, I think that the really horrifying and troubling actions that we're seeing our federal government taking are just putting a finer point on what was always true and already true, and that's that change comes from the bottom up. Change starts in communities and starts with individuals working together.
So it's up to us as grassroots organizers to help get that message out.
I was also one of the moderators on the panel for this event with the ever so wonderful Marc Steiner, and you know, it's interesting because a lot of the conversation was around how do you make things palatable, not palatable, but how do you make things clear for people who are in an everyday struggle, right?
Yeah.
Not coming to them with jargon about the polar ice caps will be melting at 2% extra because of 1 degree of temperature, and therefore, like, and I'm looking at you like, we don't have any food for next weekend, right?
Yeah.
So how do we come together as communities advocating for things that may seem disparate but are all intertwined to make sure people understand how climate impacts them every day, and therefore when they're looking at people to elect, what questions should you be asking and what should you be listening for, right? They may think you not intelligent. They may think you not connected to your great-great-great-grandchildren's lives. And then you pop up with, so are you or are you not for this incinerator? Right. Are you going to make sure lead is abated from all school pipes?
Come on now.
Are you or are you not going to make sure there's housing that has clean water, you know, no asbestos, all of those things. Yeah. So, you know, it was really interesting to hear and watch the people. The folk broke out into working groups after the forum, after the panel. And it was great to listen to people talk about, you know, the ways they could move beyond their own advocacy. Sometimes we get a little wonky. And we have stats running through our heads, and we have, you know, issues that we're driving home. But we all sometimes need to pull out and look at the bigger picture because climate affects all of us.
Yeah.
You know? So.
It really does. I always be like, yo, what if the hood was green? You know, like it's a trip you can go from, you can go to the suburbs and see like no trash on the ground.
Yeah.
And then you go to the hood and it's just like piles of trash just in the alleys and stuff like that, and it's just like, what is the disconnect here? Because these people are not, they're definitely not going fuck the earth.
No.
And and I don't care about air.
Yeah.
It's a matter of like education and access. Exactly. You know what I mean? Like
back to education.
If people back to education again. If people know, then they don't throw trash on the ground. They don't they do recycle, you know, and
it's just like when we used to see the drains painted, and I wonder why that isn't still a stronghold, but we would see the drains painted saying this water goes to the bay. Yeah. Right. And we've been able to turn the bay's ecosystem around. Yeah. Right. So what other things can we be doing in the hood? Yeah. And in communities to flag for folk this is ours.
Yeah.
And maybe when this house is torn down, let's ask for a green space as
Mhm.
opposed to another space.
Yeah, I shout out to everybody doing the urban farms in the city, because I often drive by areas that I remember when houses were there. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I remember I see some of these lots, and it's like, oh, I remember when that was a school or that was a church or that was like a block of houses.
Yep.
And now they're like farms and stuff like that. So I feel like more of that stuff will help, and you know, hopefully through Darna's reporting,
yes,
we will change the world.
Thank you, Darna.
Another way we can change the world is if you continue to give the Real News money. We are a nonprofit. And we do not take any corporate funding or advertising, so we are fully funded by you, the viewers, those that, you know, are interested in the real news. So send money, donate if you haven't already.
TheRealNews.com.
TheRealNews.com.
We want to continue to bring you independent news. We want to make sure that the news is by you and for you. So definitely send us a plug. You know, if there's something that we should be covering, should show up on the Baltimore podcast, let us know. And we want to make sure that the real news is for you. So
shout out to Dave Hebden, Stephen Frank, Will Arenas, who are making everything happen behind the scenes.
Jocelyn Dombrowski.
Congratulations,
Jocelyn.
Jocelyn just got proposed to.
Somebody put a ring on it.
About to get married. Somebody put a ring on it. Congratulations on that. And shout out to Dwayne Gladden, who's not here today, but also helps put the podcast together. And thank you all for watching. What else?
Soldier.
He
put a ring on it.
Soldier put a ring on it. Shout out to Soldier.
He's our building manager here at The Real News.
He got married last Sunday. I was not invited to the wedding, but I feel like maybe that was just a slight oversight. I feel like I found out like the day of, everybody was like, "We going to Soldier wedding." I was like, okay. Cool.
You know what? We love you, Easy. You can be invited to my wedding.
Okay. Cool.
Right, exactly.
I'm good with that.
Exactly.
I'll be there.
All right, fam.
We're going to close out with my man Vaughn Vargas, I mentioned earlier, who put together the Ceasefire song. This is his song called Concrete, Still I Rise. Thanks for watching, y'all. We'll see y'all next week.
The thief got them all at odds. Overachievers, minimum of stars. This time got me on the bars. Nothing like them Audemars. Clowns shoot darts, but I let it dodge. Keep me on the ball, got me straight body hard. Stay up in the armor guard, I be on that armor all. Mirage flaws, lighters lighting from afar. In the dark, we the squad, straight imposing on the frauds. Crazy fugazi, let them know that maybe they be off. And it's the sound of a champion. I be like a Rothstein champion in 10 years. Cause I survived through the drain tears. Then I got my victory the same year. Better know that it's a champion. About to put my stamp in my real stance, What's something to gain? Cause through my sanity and pain in the game, I remain conquering my lane. Aim, while some are losing focus for the fame. And vanity I blame, but I reign sane.
I've been through the fights. I done seen the struggle, but I see the light. And I done so much stress and sacrifice. And after all that trouble, you know I still rise.
Every champ destiny is tested. Either you pass or you just fail, or prevail through the tough trail. A win, I can feel it coming in the air. Trusted, I could drink and taste it. I be how victory, this vision got me faded. And my dream keep me wasted. Going forward, I won't stop even when I made it. Being different cards, cut from a different cloth. You gon' have to stick to it, they gon' try to take you off. Put you down, hope you fail, see you give it up, Not a chance if I'm giving breath up in my lungs. Get up again, even from a loss. Keep your head to the hills, peak and valleys you gon' cross. The tears dry, ain't another sign, only